A lot of people think of me as a research person, and in reality, that's not the case. I've kind of been typecast in that role. Everything I've done has been with a specific purpose in view to advance chiropractic. Victor Hugo is credited with having said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." But I must disagree, because the thing that's far more powerful than that idea is a single individual who has the vision, the passion, the commitment, and the technical skill to turn that into a reality. That's the opportunity you have to become a chiropractor.
Well, welcome to the Vitalistic Voice. Today, I'm really extra excited today because my guest today has been, I'm going to say, a hero of mine ever since I've been very, very young in practice. I don't want to give away his age, but he has definitely been in the spotlight for me, and I've certainly followed his career ever since the mid 90s when I first met him. And I remember being introduced to Dr. Christopher Kent at a DE conference, and I believe it was in Miami at the I want to say it was the Fontainebleau Hotel. And I remember Dr. Kent giving a talk at that DE seminar, and he used these dueling slide projectors. And the slide projectors, and of course, this was a time when there was no digital pictures, there's no digital cameras, there's no internet, and the slide projectors would go back and forth from side to side. And I remember being in tears looking at some of the pictures that Dr. Kent had on the screen, old pictures of BJ Palmer and pictures of Palmer College and the history of chiropractic. So I was just absolutely mesmerized. And of course, I'd followed Dr. Kent through his career. I became a subscriber to On Purpose with Dr. Kent and Dr. Gentempo. But I'm going to say Dr. Christopher Kent is probably the smartest person I've ever met in the chiropractic profession. So I'm so grateful to have you here on the podcast today, Dr. Christopher Kent.
Well, thank you. And I certainly appreciate all that you've done for chiropractic in a variety of roles
Well,
and
thank
still
you.
looking for new ones.
Yeah, still, well, that's it, and that's the whole idea, is still looking for new ones. It's just such an exciting profession to be part of, and making connections like yourself and learning more about what's going on in the not I mean not just the history, because I know you're quite an expert on the history of chiropractic, but in the science and the research of vertebral subluxation, you are really leading the charge there. So I'd love to just talk about that. What's happening right now with Dr. Christopher Kent and the Journal of Vertebral Subluxation Research, and what are you currently working on?
Well, there's always something going on. And, a lot of people think of me as a research person. And in reality, that's not the case. I've kind of been typecast in that role. And that everything I've done has been with a specific purpose in view to advance chiropractic. And when Dr. Gentempo and I met, and started discussing some of the challenges facing chiropractic, one of the biggest that confronted us was the fact that there were chiropractors who understood chiropractic philosophy, that were excited about what they did. But there was doubt in their mind as to whether they were actually delivering the product that they wanted to deliver and that they hoped that they were delivering. And we thought what we need are objective means of documenting the various aspects of this thing we call vertebral subluxation, the ability to do so in a form that's reliable, that's reproducible, that's valid, that measures what it claims to be measuring, that has an impact on human health, and that is favorably responsive to the work that we do. And that kind of gave birth to the Insight Subluxation Station. And when we introduced that, another chapter unfolded because there were some people in the regulatory arena that didn't share our enthusiasm. So next thing you know, I find myself dealing with lobbying firms, dealing with uh, individuals involved in state politics, testifying before regulatory agencies and so forth. And I'll share with you a moment that was really kind of pivotal because again, it shows how all this stuff kind of unfolded. We were having a debate, and the debate was about vertebral subluxation and the role of chiropractic. And David Chapman Smith, if you remember him,
Yeah.
the former Secretary General of the World Federation of Chiropractic, talked about how a study had been done in Canada and that this study in Canada suggested that the people weren't ready to accept the concept of vertebral subluxation and that chiropractors should become what the public perceived them as being. And I was loaded for bear. It was just things were unfolding serendipitously because on the flight in, I was reading an airline magazine. Some of you may remember magazines, where they had these things that were like printed and you could read. Well, anyway, they had these on airplanes, and there was an article in there about people's perception of attorneys. And since David Chapman Smith was an attorney, I said, well, Mr. Chapman Smith, he said, I have a study here, a very recent study that discusses what people think attorneys are. And I went into this whole diatribe about, they were non-trustworthy and unscrupulous and didn't attend to their clients well and all of these things. And I said, are you suggesting that your profession aspired to become how you're perceived by the public? And he kind of smiled and said, sarcastically, of course, well, you sound like you could become an attorney. And at that point, something clicked, and I did. I said, that's the next step. I have to become an attorney. So I did.
Amazing. And you've had such a long list of credentials behind your name. Yeah, and I'd love to go back, before we talk about this. And I
Sure.
remember I did a podcast with Dr. David Fletcher, who of course took over CLA from you and Dr. Gentempo. And
Mhm.
I'd like to touch more on that. But first, before we get into that, I'd love to know a little bit of the history of Dr. Kent. Let's talk a little bit about your journey into chiropractic college, through chiropractic college, and where it took you. How did you get into doing what you are doing currently?
Oh, it's really interesting because I've always approached things somewhat methodically. And when I was about 16 years old, I had just graduated from high school, started college, was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life. So this is pretty important stuff. So let me research it. And I knew at that point that I wanted to help people, that I wanted to be perhaps some kind of doctor. But I was raised by my family, and my grandmother particularly was a Christian Scientist. So we didn't do medicine much at all. And I was brought up with this concept that if you understand the perfection of your creation, you'll enjoy health. And that always kind of made sense to me. Um, and then I became interested, of course, in school and science. And I said, is there a relationship here? So I started looking into the various healthcare professions. I looked at medicine, I looked at osteopathy, I looked at naturopathy, uh, I looked at the anatomically specific um, professions like dentistry, optometry, podiatry, all of this. And I'm doing all this research, and lo and behold, my then best friend noticed that I was experiencing some health challenges. And he said, why don't you go see my neighbor? Because he's a chiropractor and he might be able to help you. That's a chiropractor. What's a chiropractor? And he says, oh, they work on your spine and your nervous system. And you should have this done. Go see a chiropractor. Well, I had no idea what a chiropractor was, 16 years old. So what did I do? I asked my mother. Why my mother? Well, because she was my mother. And secondly, because she worked at the University Medical Center. She would certainly know about this stuff. And I asked her, what's a chiropractor? And she had this horrified look on her face as if I had uttered a bad word. And she's, a chiropractor? Why, that's someone who cracks your bones. I said, no, wait, cracks your bones? You mean they fracture? She said, I guess they must. You can hear it snap. I've seen it done. She said, I don't know why anyone would want that. And I said, well, I don't either. So I had a serious contradiction to resolve. My friend, who was seemingly rational and certainly ambulatory, was seeing this chiropractor and claiming benefit. And my mother is talking about cracked bones and iatrogenic fractures. So I said, well, how can I answer this question? How can I reserve um, some semblance of sanity here? And I said, let me try a ruse. So I called a chiropractor who was nearby, and I told him that I was writing a paper about chiropractic for school, which was kind of a half-truth. I said, may I come and interview you? And he said, of course. So I asked him that question that we've all been asked so many times, which is, what is it that chiropractors do? And he said, chiropractic is based on four simple concepts. He said, the first is that the body is a self-healing mechanism. If you cut your finger, it heals. If you cut the finger of a corpse, it does not. Life heals. He said, second, the nervous system is the master system of the body. Every dimension of the human experience is processed through the nervous system. Every thought, every feeling, every action, every reaction is processed through the nervous system. Okay. And he said, and third, and it gave me goosebumps then, and it still does today, over 50 years later, yes. He said, when there's interference with the function of the nerve system, because it distorts your perception of the world and compromises your ability to respond to the world, not only can it adversely affect your physical well-being, but it can have significant psycho-emotional consequences as well. And when that happens to a significant number of individuals in a society, you have a sick society. He said, and finally, what I do as a chiropractor is work to locate and correct the cause of that interference. And I thought, wow.
You're giving me goosebumps right now.
I
That
said, I want it. And he said, okay. So I started seeing him. And what I thought was really cool was that many things that I had never mentioned to him were improving dramatically. Things went away I hadn't told him about. And I had a newfound energy, a newfound joy for life. And one day he said, I think you should become a chiropractor. And I said, well, what does that entail? And he said, well, you have to make a pilgrimage to the People's Republic of Davenport, Iowa. And I said, Davenport, Iowa? Why? And he said, well, that's where it's done. And I'll age myself a little. People say, well, didn't you consider any of the other colleges? You never thought about Sherman or Life West or Parker? I said, they didn't exist. Yes, I'm really that old. So he looked at me and he said, let me make a phone call. Got on the phone. He's kind of nodding and looking at me and nodding and looking at me. And he said, they got an opening for their July class. This is June. He said, next month you can go. And I just said, okay, just like that.
Wow.
Didn't ask for more information, didn't ask for particulars, had no idea how I'd pay for it, had no idea how I'd fare in Davenport. But I just, okay, that's where it's done. That's where I'll go. And the rest, as they say, is history. And I'll never forget when my mother dropped me off at the old Palmer College, before they had all the fancy new buildings and air conditioning and so forth. She looked around, and the Palmer letterhead had always says, the largest and finest chiropractic college in the world. And I remember her looking at me and saying, if this is the largest and the finest, I'd hate to see the smallest and the worst.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
And she said, okay. And I said, okay. And, I'm carrying my stuff out of the car. And she's saying, you mean now that you've seen it, you're actually going to stay? And I said, yes. And that's kind of how it all began. Now, at Palmer in those days, they had a very strict dress code, and they regulated the length of your hair. And I had always been a bit of a rebel. And when I was in the clinic as an intern, I said, well, I'll meet them halfway. I'll compromise. I'll purchase a wig and stuff my long hair, which was down to about shoulder length, into the wig. And that way no one will know and everything will be just fine. And everything was just fine until one day I was adjusting a patient and the wig fell off and the hair fell down. Well, next thing you know, um, I'm expelled for long hair. And I'm trying to get into another school, and I'm exploring what my options are. And I met this amazing man, Dr. Fred Barge, who kind of took me under his wing, and we became friends. He became a mentor of mine, and then CCE came along and changed the direction of chiropractic completely. I had joined the faculty because I thought, other than being a chiropractor and delivering care to patients, how can I have a greater impact? And I said, I can become involved in making more chiropractors. So I'm on the faculty. CCE is coming in, and we've got students running around wielding hypodermic needles and drawing blood and listening to places you wouldn't normally listen to. And lo and behold, I get called in to the administrative executive committee, they called it. And I was on it because I was president of the faculty senate. And they started asking me questions. They said, is it true that in your microbiology class on May 4th at 7:15 a.m. you said blah, blah, blah? And, it was basically stuff about CCE. And I said, I don't recall if these quotes are accurate, but I will stipulate that, yes, I believe that, and I very likely did say that. And they said, don't you believe that spinal analysis is just a form of diagnosis and that adjusting the spine is a treatment? And the person who raised that question was Dr. Galen Price himself. And I just looked him in the eye and I said, that's not what you taught me, Dr. Price. He just hung his head. And they said, if we don't accept CCE, our graduates will not be able to practice in many states, and we simply can't afford to lose that large segment of our student body. So you have to stop doing this. And I said, I can't stop doing it. You want me to resign? And they said, are you willing to do that? And I said, sure. And I had no idea what I would do. I mean, I had a little practice in Davenport, but probably not enough to sustain me in, as they put it, the life I'd been accustomed to. And I left. And I got a phone call from another name you might recognize, Reggie Gold. And Reggie Gold at that point was president of ADIO, which was a chiropractic college, and it stood for above, down, inside out. And he said to me, I understand you're available for work. And I said, yes. He said, well, I've heard your story. He said, I'd like to discuss something with you, the possibility of your becoming the academic dean of ADIO with the intent that one day you'll be president. And I said, I'd be very interested in that. So we met, and next thing I know, I'm in ADIO. Well, then they had a coup. And next thing I know, I'm out of ADIO. And I'm with Reggie starting this new profession called Spinology. And I'm working for his wife, Irene, doing board reviews. And lo and behold, this young man named Patrick Gentempo attended one of my board reviews. And he said to me, is this your business? And I said, no. And he said, have you ever thought of going into business for yourself? And I said, not really. And he said, let's do that. And I just said, okay. And it was at that point we had identified this issue that I shared with you about what he used to call the silent dread. And that is people fearing that they're delivering a service without really knowing whether or not what they're doing is what they're claiming and hoping they're doing. So we said, what can we do? Well, I got interested in electromyography after reading a scientific paper by a pair of mental health professionals. Yes, shrinks. And they found that when they observed patients with specific health problems, mental health issues, their gait, their structure, their posture was all off. And they said, I wonder if there's a way we can objectively measure that. And they said, yes, we can. We can use surface electromyography. And they did. And they came up with this elegant term, dysponesis. Dys, not right, dysfunction. And ponos means work or energy. So they said that there's an error in how they're using their energy. And I said, this is really great stuff. So I did a literature search, thinking that my computer would explode with references, and there was only one by these two authors. And I asked an engineer I knew who was involved in biofeedback and surface EMG. I said, are you familiar with dysponesis? And he kind of smiled and said, of course. And I said, well, what happened to dysponesis? And he said, psychotropic drugs and psychotherapy were unable to change those patterns. And it just, after its 15 minutes of fame, faded away. I said, I bet specific corrective vertebral subluxation will change those patterns. So we started working with surface EMG. And then we said, but there's the rest of the nervous system that we have to deal with as well. There's the autonomic system. We have to look at how well the body is regulating temperature. And we have to look at how well the body is regulating that part of the nervous system that controls the organs, glands, and the blood vessels. So we looked at stuff that we could measure that had some justification in the literature for its use. And we developed what we called Subluxation Station, which looked at surface electromyography, which looked at skin temperature differentials, which looked at heart rate variability, and it also had available as options looking at range of motion and algometry or pressure point sensitivity. So we developed this device, and we said, you know, giving people a piece of machinery without their having an understanding of how it works will not be effective. So we came up with the idea of having a retreat where they would leave their offices and come to this idyllic environment in Colorado and live in the mountains and look at the moon through the observatory and observe the universe and the animals and the plants and all of this stuff while they learned about this instrument and what it could mean to their practice. And that gave birth to the total solution movement. And then we saw another issue. After they left total solution, they were by themselves. So we came up with the idea of On Purpose, a monthly audio subscription service, which in its first incarnation was recorded on cassette tapes. Some of your listeners probably never heard of such a thing, but that's how it was done. And that allowed people to receive podcasts before podcasts existed. And our tagline was then and still remains now, yes, we're still in business. When you're on purpose, you are not alone. And it created that cohesiveness. So that's kind of my journey, or at least part of it. And then lo and behold, folks on the other side were trying to create political problems in various jurisdictions and making a big deal of the fact that the World Federation of Chiropractic was a non-governmental organization with the United Nations and blah, blah, blah. So we said, well, I guess we'll have to do that too. So we did so, just happened to be in the right place or the wrong place, depending on your perspective, at the right time. And they had an individual who had passed away who was treasurer, and they said, we need a treasurer. No one wanted to do it. I said, well, I'll do it. The next thing I know, I'm elected chair. And I'm in Geneva talking to all these people about chiropractic. So another thing I did, just never planned to do it. It just seemed to be where I was led. And that's worked reasonably well for me in my life. Um, just letting go.
I would say that's worked incredibly well for you, and this has been absolutely brilliant because I've known bits and pieces of your story, but you just filled in a lot of the blanks for me, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. And of course, it raises a whole bunch of more questions. I remember, well, first of all, my wife was a Total Solution grad. She went to Colorado in 1998 when she was actually 8 months pregnant with
Mhm.
with our second son. And I remember her uh, doing the ropes course actually, and she
Mhm.
called me and let me know that she did. And of course, I was back here at home looking after the practice, and she said that everybody was so supportive, and she was able to complete and do finish the ropes course. And she said it was one of the best experiences ever. But we became on purpose subscribers, and it was right around 1998, and I actually still have the volumes. I have probably 2 years of volumes of cassette tapes with
Mhm.
science, art, and philosophy editions, of course, in each volume. And I must have worn those out because every month I would get them, and as the first day that I would get them, I would play them in my car, cassette deck of my
Mhm.
car, and just run them through and run them through. It was just brilliant. But I would say, so I want to ask you, I personally, and we got a subluxation station back right around the 1998, 1999. It was somewhere right in there, and it was relatively new technology at that point, and it was the Insight 7000, I believe, was the first one that we got.
Mhm.
But I would say that that has been one of the biggest advancements in the profession from a couple of standpoints with the assessment of the relationship of vertebral subluxation on the nervous system, but more importantly, and this is where we really benefited from that piece of equipment, was the ability to explain and visually explain the relationship of subluxation and the changes through a course of chiropractic care as we corrected the subluxation and the improvement neurologically.
And that was a side effect, by the way. In other words, we created the device without even thinking about patient communications. We created the device to improve the ability of the chiropractor to provide care. And lo and behold, chiropractors started using it in their practice and explaining, and it's such a nice bridge um, from a condition-centric entry point, which is where, as you well know, many patients are, to your potential as a human being perspective, which is a very different thing. So how do you build that bridge? Well, it's really very simple. People would come in and they'd say, oh, it hurts here, it hurts there. You go through the whole thing. And then you say, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do an examination. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at patterns of sensitivity along your spine and see if there's a relationship between them. Because notice how you can turn your head further one way than the other. Well, yes. And notice how you tend to favor one leg over the other. Well, yes. Well, all of that's interconnected. And the thing that controls that are the muscles surrounding your spine. And we're going to measure the activity in those muscles and see how that relates to your posture and movement. There's something even more important, and that's the part of your nervous system that controls your organs, glands, and blood vessels. Because if your organs, glands, and blood vessels are not working at their optimum level, it's going to compromise the healing process on every level. We're going to check that too. We found that people like you are often experiencing a lot of adverse stress in their life. We're going to take a look at that. Put this all together, explain to you what we think we might be able to do for you. If we don't think we can, we'll let you know that too.
Amazing.
Done.
It's amazing.
How long did that take? Not long. And I just made it up.
You may have had a bit of experience on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is really interesting, and I'd love to just kind of explore because the transition with you and Dr. Gentempo and obviously Dr. David Fletcher taking over Chiropractic Leadership Alliance,
Mm-hmm.
which is the distributor of the Insight technology, opened the door for you to explore other opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing since that time and what is the next step for Dr. Christopher Kent.
Oh, that's the question. It's funny you should mention that. Some of you may have heard about Clearview Sanitarium, which was a chiropractic mental hospital. Well, my psychiatry professor was Dr. Quigley, who was the director of Clearview. And he and I kind of became friends because, and I'll never forget him for this, he was the only person on the Palmer administration who defied the order not to issue a letter of recommendation for me. And he wrote a glowing letter of recommendation. So we always became kind of close. And I kept in touch with him. And when I told him, of my plans to develop this instrumentation and so forth, and to leave the academic community, he said, he said, I somehow think that you're going to end up back in an institution. And I said, Dr. Ridley, do you realize how that sounds, especially coming from you, since he ran a mental hospital. But anyway, and that seemed to be it. Patrick became interested in um, producing documentary uh, programs, and I had been serving on the board of trustees at Sherman, and I thought, I think I'd like to get more hands-on than just deciding how much money to pay the president. I think I might be able to do some more good if I was actually there. Well, I don't know if I am or not, but I'm here. And we started out by building, and again, it's all doing stuff that had to be done. You know, people think, oh, research and evidence-informed practice. Well, I saw misuse of the term evidence-informed practice by the individuals who seek to limit us. And I said, that cannot be. So we created a Center for Scholarly Activity here, which dealt with evidence-informed practice, clinical procedures, uh, the integration of research with the three elements of evidence-informed practice, where we have the best available external evidence, the knowledge and experience of the chiropractor, and the desires and needs of the patient. That's all it is. It's got nothing to do with limiting yourself to sore backs and stiff necks. So that was that. And I don't know what the next step is. I have no idea. Right now, I'm getting involved in some international stuff because there was an Australian professor we had at Palmer College. Her name was Maxine McMullen. Some of you may have studied pediatrics under her. She had a pediatric seminar thing going too. And she would say, Christopher, something's festering in my gut. And just that phrase, festering my gut, was so graphic. Well, what's been festering in my gut lately is that we have about 333 million people in the United States, and we've got 8 billion in the world. And the vast majority of those individuals are in places where chiropractic is unregulated and there's no chiropractic college. Wow. And we spend all this effort trying to comply with accreditation standards and FERPA and Title IX and Title this and Title 19 and blah, 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 all this stuff that simply doesn't exist anywhere else, or in many other places, I should say. Now I'm saying, is there a way we can penetrate this international opportunity that exists?
Wow. Wow. So tell me now,
I'm not going to Mars, don't worry.
well, your
No.
current role at Sherman, what is the direction of that role, and of course your relationship with JVSR?
Mhm.
What are you currently working on? And I want to kind of set you up here because I
Well,
know.
some of it I have to be careful and tread gingerly because it's somewhat confidential. And
Sure.
there are those who might sabotage some of these efforts. But the hint I'll give you is that we're looking for ways to expand our reach.
Awesome. Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about the paper that you just released with the relationship of the autonomic nervous system?
Oh, sure, that's kind of fun. Papers always have a story, as do books. You know, another thing I was very interested in and was involved in the early integration in chiropractic was magnetic resonance imaging, because of my own situation where I had a stroke and I went to see kind of one of the gurus of magnetic resonance imaging in the early days. And we became friends when we were talking. And we ended up co-teaching a course in advanced imaging um, at Palmer West back in the day. And told Patrick I thought we should get one of these MRI things so that we could look at the structure of the body without having to use ionizing radiation. And we ended up doing that too. So here we are. We've got this MRI thing going. We've got this Insight thing going. And how can we bring this to the world? Well, again, unfortunately, the people who were most attracted to it were those that were interested in substantiating personal injury cases rather than those that were interested in improving patient care. And now that we have this war on imaging within the profession, where there are some individuals who don't think we should be doing X-rays or cone beam CTs or MRIs, and we're dealing with that. And you've certainly had your experience with that in Canada. So doing that, still lecturing. The paper, the reason I brought up the MRI is because a colleague of mine and I wrote a book on MRI for chiropractors. And we sent it to a publisher. Publisher sent it to some reviewers in chiropractic, and they basically said it's fine. Just remove the stuff about vertebral subluxation and we'll publish it. And I said, no. So they didn't publish it. Well, I also had an opportunity to publish a paper in the journal that wanted me to do something about assessment of nervous system function. I said, oh, this is perfect. So I wrote the paper that you referenced, the one on the somatic and autonomic assessment of vertebral subluxation. And what they had said was, you got to pare this thing way down. They said, you've got far too much redundant material in here. You've got material in here which has already been published in other journals. And we just want the new stuff. And I said, well, that would require that people read a tremendous volume of pre-existing literature. I wanted a paper that would stand on its own. And they said, no, that stuff's got to be removed. So it ended up being published by the Journal of Vertebral Subluxation Research by Dr. McCoy and his team. So that's kind of the latest stuff that's out there. And I wanted to create a document that kind of put it all in one place and related it to vertebral subluxation. By the way, this other journal had no problem with that term at all. None. So when someone tells you that they have to talk about manipulation and spinal lesions to get published in index journals, that's not true.
Right. So I know, and we personally have talked a lot about the direction of the education system in chiropractic.
Yes.
And obviously you being firsthand involved in that. Where do you see, so to advance the profession, and I'm going to try to set you up here because I know you had some brilliant ideas when we sat at dinner going, and this is going back probably a couple of years ago now. You had some brilliant ideas on where you felt the school system needed to go to advance the profession and make it more accessible for people to understand the principle of chiropractic. Can you comment where you feel the profession needs to go from an education standpoint?
Sure. I think we have to get away from a one-size-fits-all model for every student. I think there are some groups that are almost ideally suited for a full-time, synchronous, in-person experience. For example, veterans whose GI Bill will cover the cost of their schooling. Individuals that are used to working intimately together because their lives literally depend on it, that have a cohort of individuals who could become virtually instant patients. And for a group like that, that type of experience is great. We also have individuals that are very bright and self-motivated that would like to be able to study chiropractic without necessarily having to move away for 3.5 to 4 years. That could do a lot of the didactic work online. They wouldn't be bound to a 3.5 or 4 year time frame. If it took them longer because they wanted to continue with their responsibilities in terms of work and family, they could do that. So there would be that level of flexibility, yet they would still get meaningful hands-on work by attending intensive residential sections while mentoring with successful practicing chiropractors, a variety of successful practicing chiropractors nearby, so that again, of course, there would be some travel, there'd be some hands-on work by necessity. There would also be, from the very beginning, experience in working with patients. As their proficiency developed, their levels of responsibility would increase. And they would have the opportunity, as I said, to pursue something. When I was a student, yes, way back when, we had a lot of second career students. We had a lot of people who came to Palmer that were 50, 60 years old, that already had a successful career, and many of them were veterans, and they decided they wanted to become chiropractors. I also think that there are other cohorts that deserve our attention. One of the great things about chiropractic is that from the get-go, women were embraced. Women were welcomed into the chiropractic profession, not so African Americans. And I think we owe it to the African Americans who were turned away in the day for political and economic reasons to address that inequity too. The same thing can be said for Native Americans. We can talk about all kinds of groups that we just haven't reached. And I think if we look beyond going to chiropractic spiz fests, as I call them, practice building, practice management, get jacked up about chiropractic type groups. And there's nothing wrong with that. I encourage that. Of course you should be. But if we look beyond that cohort of people who are individuals that already have a means of getting into chiropractic, 8 billion people.
This is brilliant conversation, and this is largely undiscussed in the profession, but you've
I
just
know, and I'm probably saying more than I should, but I'm
well,
telling you what I think.
it needs to be discussed, and so I
Yeah.
appreciate you opening that door. That's incredible, actually, and I'm going to be very honest, and that's not an angle that I've ever thought of, and again, I'm all for advancing the profession, but those are certainly things that need to be discussed and pursued. So
And,
thank
and, and these aren't my ideas exclusively, by the way, so by no means. Our president, Dr. Boyle, has come up with some great ideas to expand our reach. Other institutions have done so. Other professions have done so. It's now possible to become a doctor of physical therapy in 2 years. 2 years. With a lot of independent study, with some intensive residential, and then practice apprenticeship type training. 2 years, you can become a doctor of physical therapy where you have direct access to patients, and in the vast majority of jurisdictions in the United States, the ability to perform spinal manipulation. So, do we want to flip this? Do we want physical therapists to become what chiropractors could have become? I don't think so.
And when you look at it, wouldn't you say that a lot of the education system is taking chiropractic towards a physical therapy type of modality? As
Absolutely.
right,
Absolutely. There's no
we're infringing
question
in their
about
turf,
it.
right? Yeah.
And, as I said, when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, is there a place for therapists? Yes. Is there a place for nutritionists? Yes. Is there a place for rehabilitation therapists? Yes. I could go on and on. Optometrists, podiatrists, dentists, of course. But none of that's chiropractic. And only chiropractors analyze and correct vertebral subluxations to allow people to express their potential as human beings in every aspect of the human experience. Wow. A, who in their right mind wouldn't want that? And B, why are we standing in the way? And what can we do to get out of the way?
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, so just a few rapid fire questions here.
Rapid fire.
Rapid fire, yes. So
Okay.
tell me, going through, and I mean, you've had incredible experiences now for over 50 years in the profession. Uh, who was your biggest influence? Was there one person?
I wouldn't say there was one person, but I would say, of course, there was BJ. There was Fred Barge because of our relationship. There was Reggie Gold because of our relationship. And all rebels, all people who did crazy stuff. I hope one day I could have as much influence as they did, more.
Well, I can vouch. You certainly have had a tremendous influence on many, many people in the profession. So here's another question. What would you say to a student, first of all, a student who may be thinking about chiropractic college or a chiropractic education? What should that student look into? What should that student consider before making a decision, A, to go to chiropractic college, and B, where to go?
Well, to me, of course, the place to go is Sherman. And for a variety of reasons, because we have held the line. We have a program called Showcase Sherman, where will pay their way to come here and see the place and participate in a program which has some team building stuff. Uh, they get to see the dissection lab. One person said a very moving experience for her was holding a brain in her hands. She thought that's a person's, yeah, things like that. Um, Another individual was moved by the fact that that first time they took a palpation class where they actually learned how to identify spinal landmarks and find normal and abnormal areas of the spine, and how amazed they were that they could do that, and how they could grow into that. Um, find a chiropractor, if you haven't already, that you're seeing, that understands what chiropractic is and that can help you go through some of those questions and thoughts. I remember person who became a student here at Sherman said, well, I've been going to a chiropractor ever since I was a little kid, but I never knew what chiropractic was. My parents came, we got checked, we got adjusted if necessary, and then we went home. And no one ever explained to me what chiropractic was about. Not even this person who obviously was very much into it. So find out what you can. And I know it sounds kind of spooky when I say things like, listen to your heart. And it's not your will alone that's operative in this dynamic. In my case, there really wasn't much to think about. It was just, well, yes, of course. And if that's what you're feeling, don't let all those gremlins talk you out of it.
All right, here's another one for you. I want to open the door for you here. If there were no restrictions on you, be it
Mhm.
financially, economically, geographically, philosophically, anything that you want to do in the profession, you had the green light to do it, what would that be?
Well, I jokingly say that I would start Kent Straight. Some of you may remember Kent State University from a long time ago in the 60s during the Cold War. But in any event, uh, I would do what I can to bring chiropractic to the world using some of those methodologies that we have. I'd take them, one of the positive thinking people I hear, a lot of them do this. They'll say, well, if you had $100 million, what would you do? Well, that's what I would do. So I have to figure out a way to do it without $100 million.
Right.
Maybe I can start at Sherman. Maybe we can grow from there.
Well, Dr. Kent, this has been a treat for me, and like I said, I have been one of your biggest fans for many many years. I hold you in tremendous esteem, and I think you are absolutely, in my opinion, the, if not the smartest person in chiropractic, and you're definitely in the top three that I've
We're
ever
in
met.
trouble if we are.
Well, we certainly are, that's for sure. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being on the podcast today. Can I give you the last word and say, is there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Sure. Victor Hugo is credited with having said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." But I must disagree, because the thing that's far more powerful than that idea is a single individual who has the vision, the passion, the commitment, and the technical skill to turn that into a reality. That's the opportunity you have to become a chiropractor.
Well, there is a mic drop if I've ever heard one. That's incredible. Well, Dr. Christopher Kent, thank you so much. I can't tell you how grateful I am for you to be with us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Colin.